Welcome back to another episode of Word Safari. This is just going to be a one-off episode on a particular Indo-European root and its cognates in English that I think you will find interesting. That root is the Indo-European root sekw. If you're wondering, the sound qu was what we call a labiovelar sound in Indo-European. The reason we write the W above the line instead of being its own letter is because we think that this was actually one sound that was made at the same time, like qu. You say the K and the W at the same time, not a K after a W, which is why we write it like that. So just so you know what that particular annotation means. What did this root mean in Indo-European? Well, the primary meaning of this root was simply to follow. That was the basic meaning of this root. We're going to look at how this root comes into English in the following slides here and for the rest of the episode, but just to tell you straight up, most of the cognates we get from this Indo-European root come through the Latin verb sequor. You can see the sekw part right there at the beginning of the Latin word sequor, which literally means I follow. The word sequor meant I follow in Latin, and you can see the sekw right there with the verb ending added onto it. As with every Latin verb, this verb had a past participle, and that was sequtus. So it's spelled a little bit differently in Latin between the main part of the verb, the present tense sequor, and the past participle sequtus. One spelled with a Q, one spelled with a C. We don't need to worry about that. You can still see that it's basically the same root that is being spelled a little bit differently, but this is going to have consequences, as it were, for some of the words that we get in English from these two Latin forms of the same verb. Sequor, which was the present tense, secutus, which is the past participle, which literally meant having followed. Okay, so that's where we're sort of getting these terms from, and we're going to see that here as we follow through with this topic. Let's just start looking at some particular words in English that we get from this sekw root, specifically the sekwer verb in Latin. Of course, we got the word sequel, right? The word sequel, it just means something that follows. If you have a movie franchise and there's a particular movie and one follows another, we call it a sequel. So you can see how that makes sense. Sequence comes from this particular Latin word as well. The literal meaning of the word sequence is it's a set of things and one thing follows upon another thing, and that's why we call it a sequence. This one might be a little less obvious, so let me explain how we get the word sequester from this particular Latin word that means follow as well. In Latin, sequester was actually a noun, not a verb, and a sequester was a person who was like a trustee or a mediator. It was literally a person who would follow up or follow through on a particular situation to make sure that it was resolved satisfactorily as far as the different parties were concerned. Usually what a sequester, this particular kind of individual, would do is if there was some dispute about property, for instance, the sequester would take the property and make sure that neither party could use it until the dispute was resolved. And so in other words, he would, as we would say, sequester that property. And that's where we get the verb from, where the modern meaning of the word sequester means to, like, take something away or remove it from circulation or whatever. And that's ultimately where that meaning of the term sequester that is common today comes from. Our word sect also comes from this Latin root sekw. You can see that it probably comes from the participle secutus and a noun form that comes off of that, which specifically was the Latin noun secta, which is just a way. In a philosophical or maybe religious sense, it could be like a school of thought. So literally, this means the teachings you follow or the way of life you follow. And that's the idea of following there. Okay, so you can see how the word follow kind of shines through when you understand the etymology of this particular term. Later connotations, of course, you probably know that we oftentimes use the word sect today in somewhat of a negative sense, in the sense of like a group that is cut off from other people and are doing, practices, whether philosophical, religious, political, whatever, that are considered odd maybe by the rest of society. It turns out that there's another root in Indo-European and Latin that is sect or sect, and that means to cut. And there's different words that we get in English from that other root that means to cut, like dissect means to cut apart, literally. So dissect does not have to do with the sekw root. It has to do with this other root. So today, when we think of the word sect, oftentimes we associate it, whether consciously or unconsciously, with this other root that looks similar that means to cut or to cut off, because that's kind of what it has come to mean. But originally, it did come from this root that means to follow, a way of life that you follow. I like this word a lot. We talked about this word in a previous episode when we were talking about numbers, but let's go through it again. Where does this word second come from? It comes from this Latin word secundus, which just came from the sek root in Latin. Originally, secundus literally meant following. It came to mean some other things as well, but the fundamental root meaning of that word in Latin was following. And then we, of course, got the word for the thing after first. We say first, second, third when we are counting with numbers where we are trying to say it's not 1, 2, 3, it's first, second, third, right? We use these particular kinds of numbers when we are counting in a sequence. All right, that's important as well. And so second literally is just the thing that follows first. That's literally what the etymology of the word second means. So first is the main one, second is the one that follows. And then we go on down the list from there, and that is ultimately where that word comes from. That's a borrowing from French, which is in turn getting it from Latin. So that is not our native English word. And we talked about this in the numbers episode. We also have another meaning of the word second. If you have a watch, you can see the different hands, okay, and you might have a second hand on your watch, and we all know that a second is a unit of time. But where does that unit of time get its name from? Why do we call that particular small unit of time a second? Well, as you know, there are 60 seconds in a minute, and there are 60 minutes in an hour. The hour was the original way that ancient cultures broke up the day. They broke up the day into 24 hours. Originally, this was 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of nighttime, and then, of course, they needed to come up with a way to further break down the hour. And what they did is they came up with parts that were minute. And of course, this goes back to a Latin and Indo-European root as well that means small. So minute means smaller. And so they came up with these minute parts of the hour. And going all the way back to Mesopotamian culture, Mesopotamian culture had what we call a base 60 system, a sexagesimal system, where things were divided up or were sort of organized by principles of 60. And that's why ancient cultures from the Mediterranean and Near East chose to divide the hour up into 60 parts and not 10 or 12 or 100 or something like that, right? So they divided up the hour into 60 minute parts, which we today call not minutes, but minutes. It's still the same word. We just don't pronounce it quite the same way. And those were the primary minute parts of the hour. Then, what if you wanted to divide up those minute parts? You needed a secondary set of minute parts. And so there were two divisions: primary minute parts, secondary minute parts, where those primary minute parts were divided up in turn into even smaller portions of 60. Today, we call those minutes and seconds. We call the primary minute parts the minute. We call the secondary minute parts the second, which is short for secondary, essentially. And that's where we get the word second from in the sense of telling time. So that's pretty cool. It's literally the same word as when we count first, second, third. Let's start putting some prefixes, some Latin prefixes onto this root. We've seen this in a lot of previous episodes where you can take a lot of these Latin prefixes, and many episodes ago we went through all of the important ones, so you can go back and look at that if you were a little bit rusty on these prefixes. You can put a lot of these Latin prefixes onto different Latin roots. They were already doing it in Latin, so it's not something we've just invented today. They already had these compounds in the Latin language. So for instance, if you put the prefix con, which means with or together, onto sekw, you get a consequence, which is literally something that follows along with or after something else. That's all a consequence is, essentially. The adjective form of that is consequential. So if something is consequential, it contains things, it bears things that follow. And if something has things that follow from it, that it's important, it matters, it is consequential for the future. And that's why we use that term in that sense. Of course, we also have consecutive. You can tell this is from the past participle form because it has a C spelling and not a Q spelling. Not that that matters too much, but that's why the spelling is a little bit different. What does it mean if something is consecutive? It means that it's following one upon another, right? In other words, maybe it's in a sequence. Things that are in a sequence contain consecutive numbers, or movies if it has a sequel or something like that. Okay, let's put some other prefixes onto sekw in Latin. We can put the prefix x onto it. Now, when you put the prefix x onto it, the x kind of swallows the s, so we don't write the s anymore, but you can still break this up into x plus sekw. The S is just kind of hiding there in the middle of the X if you don't know to look for it. So literally, what does this mean? X means out. So if you execute something, you're following it out, which means you're following it to its conclusion. That was the original meaning of the Latin word execute. You're following up, I think is probably how we would say it in English. And you're making sure it gets concluded. If you execute a plan, you're putting it into motion and making sure that it gets carried out. That's the literal meaning of the word execute. Now, of course, we have a special meaning of the word execute in English, and this goes all the way back to Middle Ages and before, where if a court, for instance, decrees that somebody has to die, somebody has to execute the death of that person, and so we say that they've been executed. And of course, that's a pretty common use of the word execute today in English, but we still use it in the older sense of just executing a plan or something like that. What about subsequent? Sub is, of course, just the Latin word for under. So literally, you can tell that if something is subsequent, it is following under. Remember that NT ending comes from a Latin participle ending, which is why I'm saying following under, because that's our participle ending in English. In this case, following under means following after. Under in the sense of time, like you start at the top and then you read down. So what's happening later is further down on the page if you're reading a book or something like that. So that's why subsequent means following under, but really in the sense of time, it means following after. So if something is subsequent, then it is occurring afterwards. It's occurring after something else happened. Okay, here's a couple of related terms with two different prefixes. What about prosecute? Pro in Latin means forward or forth. So literally, if you prosecute something, you are following it forward. In this sense, it's kind of like executing a plan. If you prosecute a plan, you're pushing it forward. You're trying to at least follow it to its conclusion. That's what it means when you prosecute a plan. However, I think most of the time in English today, we use this in a very specific sense, which is to follow after a goal, and oftentimes that goal is in the courtroom, and it involves attempting to get justice for a crime or something like that, and we call that prosecution, and we call the person who does it the prosecutor, the individual who is in charge of following a plan forward and trying to get justice for, again, some crime or something like that. That's basically how we use the word prosecute today. There is a related word that has a slightly different prefix on the front that today means something somewhat different, at least, and that is persecute. Persecute, of course, comes from the Latin per, which means through or completely. So as far as its etymology, it doesn't look like it should mean anything that differently from prosecute, maybe a little bit, but of course it's come to mean something that is somewhat different. I think some people, when they're being prosecuted, feel like they're being persecuted, especially if they're innocent, right? And so you can see how these two terms might be similar, and they do in fact come from a similar place in the Latin language. I will say this, that in Latin, already in Roman times, that prefix per sometimes had the connotation of something negative or something being done the wrong way. And so persecute kind of, it might maintain that meaning already present 2,000 years ago in the Latin language, where per kind of had some negative connotations sometimes, at least. So when you persecute somebody, hopefully you're not persecuting anyone right now, but if you persecute somebody, you're following relentlessly after them with ill intent. That's what it literally means to persecute somebody. You want to harm them. That's, I know you know what this word means if you speak the English language. So you can see we got these pair of words here, prosecute and persecute, that have come to mean different things, certainly in modern English, but both go back to the sekw root in Latin. Let's talk about some forms that have come through French. As we know, French is a descendant of Latin, and it eroded the Latin language significantly, and it took out whole syllables and whole sounds in some cases. And this is a good example of a case where when French eroded Latin over the centuries, it actually removed the quo sound entirely. And so the sekw root just became su, literally, in French. So our word su comes from the Old French suir, which already had eroded that quo sound right out. And that came from Vulgar Latin, sequire, which Vulgar Latin was the Latin that would have been spoken on the streets in late imperial times. And so that was the form of Latin from which the Romance languages descended. I say this because if you know classical Latin, sequire was not actually a grammatically correct form of Latin, but that's clearly how they were talking on the streets for some various reasons. Okay. So sekw, which obviously comes from sequor, evolved or eroded into French as the word sue. And so literally the word sue just means to follow. But of course, in the context of a courtroom, we've been seeing that this root in the Romance languages and on into English came to have a lot of judicial connotations. So if you sue somebody, you're not just following them neutrally. You are prosecuting them or maybe persecuting them to try to get money from them, right? That's what you're trying to do if you are suing, and you're doing so in court. Of course, you can keep one of those Latin prefixes on the front, maybe change the spelling a little bit, and get a word like pursue, which is, of course, just that Latin pair again, plus the sekw root. It doesn't necessarily have the same connotations, of course, as persecute. Pursue is a little more morally neutral, I suppose, in English today. But if you pursue, again, you are following through, you're following up, you're following after somebody. I like the adjective, or the adverb rather, relentlessly in this case, like you follow relentlessly after someone. That's what it means to pursue when we use that particular word in English. You're chasing after them, right? And of course, that's, I put a cat on here because cats pursue their prey, and every animal that is a predator or a hunter pursues their prey in some way. They follow after them, they chase them, right? And that's essentially what this means. But this is a French form of the sekw root plus the Latin prefix pair. Another French form, where the qu is completely gone, but still has the t on it from secutus in this case, is suit. So suit really just comes from that Latin participle secutus. What is a suit originally? The original meaning was very neutral. It was just an act of following, or pursuit. Obviously, pursuit is the noun of pursue, and that's going to come from French as well. That was the original meaning of suit. But of course, today in English, we actually use this word in a lot of different ways if you think about it. One common way we use it, of course, is connected to all of this judicial terminology that we've been looking at. We can say that there's a suit, and if we want to be specific, we can say a lawsuit. And usually we do say a lawsuit in English today, but that's just a court case. It's an instance of somebody being pursued for damages or justice or whatever it is, right? However, you know that there are other meanings of the word suit in English. For instance, you can wear a suit. You might put on a suit, like the picture here that I've shown you, right? In particular professional or formal settings, you might need to wear a suit, right? Depending on your culture and the context and everything else. Why do we call that a suit? Well, the original meaning of this seems to have been that there would be a leader, and the leader would wear a particular kind of clothing, and then all the followers who were part of their group, whatever group this was, who were following them, would also wear that particular kind of clothing. So the whole group would wear one particular kind of clothing that came to be called a suit. And it was called a suit because it was a bunch of people following a leader, essentially. So you still see that meaning of to follow, that's sort of lurking behind the meaning of suit. And of course, today, if you're forced to wear a suit, to a wedding or a funeral or your job or whatever, you are following the lead of the people who are telling you, or the culture in general, who's telling you you need to wear a suit. You need to follow other people in that particular context. We also use the word suit in context like suit yourself. If you say, oh, that suits me well, it follows my desires, but it also means that I'm maybe matching the situation to my desires or something like that. So all of those different uses of the word suit come from this original meaning of the word suit in Old French that just means literally an act of following, and they all kind of diverge from there. If you put an E on the end, you get another word that is also from this root and is also from French that has a somewhat different meaning. A suite is a set of things in a sequence that go together. And just like suit, we use this in a number of different contexts. So for instance, a common meaning of the word suite today in English is an apartment with different connected rooms that sort of follow after each other literally. It can be used as a set of furniture, like you're buying a suite of furniture for your living room and all those pieces follow each other. They go with each other, essentially. We can also use the word suite in the sense of an arrangement of music, right, in musical terms. And so all those things have something to do with following or matching, right, which we've seen is important in the use of this term in French and on into English. We use this word sometimes, a suitor. What is a suitor? Of course, this just comes from the same root in Old French. A suitor was originally just a follower, a pretty neutral term. But of course, as you probably know, in English today, generally speaking, we use this in a very specific context. When we talk about a suitor, we're talking not just about any random follower of any random person, but it's somebody who is following after or pursuing a romantic partner. That's usually how we use the word suitor today. Okay, let's put one more prefix on to stay with the French theme. Insu. In, of course, is the French form of the Latin in with an I, so it didn't change that much. The vowel changed a little bit. So ensu literally means to follow on, which means follow after. All right, so something that ensues, just like something is subsequent, it follows under, so it follows after. If something ensues, then it follows upon something, and so it occurs after. And so this is sort of the French version of subsequent, if you want to think of it that way. Of course, French is not the only Romance language. It's the one that we in English have gotten most of our Romance terms from for historical reasons. But there is at least one case where we've gotten a form of the sekw root from another Romance language, and that is, in this case, Italian. We get the word segue from the sekw root. Now, Italian was a more conservative, and still is a more conservative Romance language than French. And by that, I mean that it didn't erode Latin near as much as French did. And so whereas in French, that qua sound is completely gone, in Italian, it's just been slightly modified from qua to gua, but it's still mostly there, as you can see. And so the Latin verb seguire, which comes from that Romance form, sequire, which again hasn't changed too much over the centuries here in the Italian peninsula, still means to follow. The semantics haven't really changed at all. This happens to be the third person singular of that verb. So segue in Italian just means it, he, she, or it follows. And so originally, this would be a notation that would be written on a musical sheet. As you know, most musical notations are in Italian, again, for historical reasons. And so it really just meant that this piece of music follows on this piece of music, and they would just write "it follows" in Italian, and that's just what that meant in the Italian language. Of course, we borrowed that term, which was originally a specific Italian musical notation, into English, and now we use it all over the place. Like if I need a segue from this slide to the next, that's a noun, not a verb, but I use it as a noun, even though that was originally a verb in Italian that just meant it follows. What I'm really doing is looking for a way of making the next slide follow this one if I am looking for a segue. That's literally what that means. Okay. So all of those terms come from that Latin verb sequor, some of them from French, some of them from Italian, a lot of the original ones from Latin. Let's talk about another related Latin term that also comes from this sekw root in Indo-European, and that is the Latin noun socius, which meant follower, literally follower, but usually meant ally. The most common meaning of this term in classical Latin was an ally. When the Romans talked about their socii, they talked about their allies on the international scene. That was usually the most common meaning of that particular term. Why does it look like socius instead of sequius if this comes from the sekw root? Well, in Proto-Indo-European and on into the daughter languages, the sort of default vowel for any Indo-European root was an E, which is why I'm putting sekw as the root up here. And you probably notice pretty much anytime I'm talking about an Indo-European root, there's an E vowel between two or more consonants. That's sort of how Indo-European roots are constructed. However, there were certain instances going back to the Proto-Indo-European days where you might want to change that E vowel out of the root and put an O vowel in there instead. It didn't change the meaning of the root. It would just be used to make the root do certain things. For instance, in certain noun formations, you would put the root in what we call O grade, which is just a fancy way of saying putting an O in the middle of the vowel instead of an E. And so this is one of those words out of many, many in Indo-European languages that descend from the O grade of the root instead of the E grade. So instead of sekw, they said sokwa, and then the W actually just ended up falling out because the y sound that was put after it kind of absorbed it. It's hard to say soquius. It's much easier to say socius, and that's essentially why the W fell out. So socius just comes from the O grade of the sekw root, but it is still the sekw root. And so you get this noun, in Latin that was just, just meant a follower, an ally, okay? As you probably know, and as you can probably already tell, we get a lot of words in English from this particular formation that also comes from Latin, but isn't the same as the verb sequor. It's a noun that is allied, if you want to call it that, with the verb sequor. We have a lot of terms that have this soc or soch, as we might say today, in it that all have something to do with what I would like to loosely say is humans working together as allies, not enemies. Okay, all of these terms don't apply if you're fighting somebody or they're not part of your group and you don't like them and you don't have anything to do with them, right? So social, that's an adjective that means pertaining to interactions between humans who are not enemies. Society, is, as a whole, the institutions that are built by humans working together as non-enemies. Doesn't mean you have to love them, but you're not fighting with them. There's, not usually a lot of violence going on in a society, hopefully, if it's a good society, right? And then, of course, the study of societies is sociology, right? You can go to school and get a degree in sociology, and this is, again, literally the study of how humans deal with each other in a generally cooperative, non-violent state, right? And so all of this goes back to this Latin noun sekw. Now, as we saw with sekw, we can put some Latin prefixes onto this root, and we can get words like associate, okay? Where does associate come from? Why are there two S's there? Well, remember when you put the Latin prefix "odd" onto things, a lot of times that D will assimilate, including in the word assimilate, to the following consonant. We had a whole episode on this. I'll put a link up there if you don't remember that particular episode. It's been a while. So associate, spelled with two S's, comes from odd plus sociare. Sociare was a verb that was made off of the Latin noun sekw. So to sociare is to ally or to unite somebody. So if you are odd sociatus, which would have been the past participle, as you can probably tell from that T on the end, just like secutus had the T on the end, which made it a past participle. If you are ad sociatus, then you are allied. Okay, that's literally what the meaning is. And then you can make a verb out of that, which means to ally, to bring things together, to group related things together. If I make an association, or if I associate two different things, I'm bringing them together because I see some similarities in them. And that's how we can use that word associate as a verb today. If you are an associate, this is a common word that's used for employees today in different stores, for instance. Then you are a person belonging to a group. You've been allied with other people who are also getting paid a paycheck by this company, and you're all working together in this particular store or restaurant or wherever it is you're working, and you might get called an associate because of that, all right? What is an association? Where we add the shun ending, which goes back to a Latin noun ending, tio, associatio would have been this word in Latin. An association is literally just a group of allied associates. I know there's a lot of redundancy there, and there's a lot of redundancy on the form of it as well, but that's all an association is. It's a group of maybe individuals, maybe larger groups like teams in a sports league, for instance, or something like that are all working together for some common purpose. One of my favorite etymologies that you probably wouldn't see coming, because honestly, there's a lot of fake etymologies that are going around on the internet, as you probably know. And this sounds like one of the fake ones because it sounds ridiculous at first, but this one's actually legit. And that is, where do we get the word soccer today? The most famous sport in the world, at least in the United States, is called soccer. But where does the word soccer come from? Even though this is mostly a term that's used in North America today, it comes from England. It comes from Oxford, actually, of all places. And this was originally a slang term for association football. So the sock in association was taken out, and there was this slang put on the end, and it was called soccer, which was short for association. This was opposed to the other prominent kind of football that was played at the time, which was rugby football, which again, in this slang terminology at Oxford in the late 1800s was called rugger, apparently, although that is not a term that seems to have survived very much, at least, and I've never heard it out in the wild, at least in the United States of America. But soccer clearly did survive. It has thrived. It's come to be, again, the normal term, at least on mainly on one continent, north of the Rio Grande, at least, for the most popular sport in the world. But it is connected to the word football, which is, of course, the normal term in most of the rest of the world, because it's just short for one particular kind of football, the kind of football that is played by the associations, the soccers that play it, and that's actually where this word comes from. So one of the things I love about Word Safari is when you follow a route like this, you just never know what you're going to see. You never know what you're going to find. That's why I like to think of it as a safari. You just have some random thing pop out at you out of the bushes, and you didn't see soccer coming from this particular Latin root, I bet, but here it is. What if you put a different Latin prefix on? Dis means apart. So to dissociate is actually the opposite of to associate. To associate is to ally things together. To dissociate is to pull them apart. Okay, so if you were trying to dissociate things, you were trying to ungroup related things. You're trying to do the opposite of associate. Okay, all of those terms we've just looked at have come from some Latin terms, whether the Latin verb sekw or the Latin noun socius, that both come from the sekw root. We've looked at French cognates and Italian cognate. We're going to finish this episode by looking at one main cognate that we still have in English today from our Germanic past. In other words, this is going to be a term that we have not borrowed from Latin or French or anybody else. This is our term, and I'm not going to tell you what it is first. I'm going to walk you through it a little bit to give you a little bit of a chance to guess what this word might be. I'm just going to tell you this is a word that you use every day. So you have known this word since the time you were 2 years old. This is not some kind of random word that you're not going to know. So first of all, we have to apply Grimm's law. So remember that for native Germanic terminology coming from Indo-European, Grimm's law occurred, which changed a number of sounds into other sounds in a predictable manner. So in Grimm's law, all K sounds become H's. Not all, but almost all. And there's certain predictable instances where that doesn't happen. This isn't one of them. This K sound in the root sekw would have become an H sound. The W would have remained. And so this root from Indo-European would have become something like sekw with like an HW sound, and then you would have put a verb ending or something on it. So it wouldn't have ended with that HW sound. But regardless, that's the first thing you need to understand, that if you're trying to figure out what this cognate would be in English today, it's not going to have a K anymore. And I'm just going to tell you it's going to be eroded further than that. But that's the first step in the erosion, all right? So I told you that this verb means to follow. It seems like in the Germanic languages, the semantics eroded or evolved to mean to follow with the eyes. And so that's a little bit of a hint I'm going to give you if you're trying to guess what this particular word is in English today that we use every day. Now, in the oldest Germanic language that we have record of, this word hadn't eroded very far. It was sekw. That's how we think that word would have been pronounced in Gothic, which was spoken around 1600 years ago. Sekw, and the on is just a verb ending. So sekw was the root, as I told you. In modern Germanic languages, that has eroded somewhat further. So, for instance, in German, and I'm going to pronounce it like German, sein. All right, the H is still spelled there. It's but you can see that it's still a basic disyllabic word. In Old English, that H was totally gone and it was spelled seon. It was still disyllabic, but it was still going to erode even further into modern English. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, if you haven't guessed what this word is yet in English, chop off the last syllable from Old English and then just pronounce the first part, say. Make it a long say, and then you're going to have to apply the great vowel shift to that long vowel E, say, that changed about 500 years ago to, that's right, C. Our word see comes from the Indo-European root sekw, again, with the fundamental meaning of to follow with the eyes. Just like French eroded this root into something like sue, we eroded this root into something like see. So see and sue are actually doublets. You would never guess that they have anything to do with each other, but they both go back to that same Indo-European root. They both kept the initial S and then the vowel and not much else. So they both eroded in a fairly similar way, although they took divergent paths to come into the English language. Once again, you never know what you're going to see on one of these word safaris. Did you see what I did there? Never know what you are going to see. I'd just like to point out that we still use the word see in this metaphorical sense. Like if somebody's trying to explain something to you, there are two different things you can say to assure them that you grasp what they're saying. You could say, I follow, or I see, and those basically mean the same thing, right? You can, whether you follow or you see, you're following them, you're following their logic. And so see actually kind of still means follow in some particular context, even though we have narrowed it down mostly to mean follow with the eyes, which means to actually use your eyes to see something. All right, that's it. That's the Indo-European root sekw. Stay tuned for another episode and we'll tackle some more roots then.